What's up, YouTube? Today's video is another episode of So You Think You Want to Be a Code Reviewer. And I'm going to be looking at a few things, some little bit of class design and mainly method design. So I'm going to start with the class design piece. It's a small code snippet, then one class, and I'll give you the reasoning for why I think the other design is better. And then mainly focus on some aspects about method design. I feel most times when I'm doing a code review, it just revolves around method design. And all the code we write is in methods. So it's either design of the method in terms of the signature or the implementation. But today is a mix of kind of both. And so anyway, let's get started. So what you see here is a base class. It's all in one file for the sake of being able to give this presentation without having to switch between tabs. Generally, depending on your organization standards, these might have to be in different CS files. So here's a base class. It's some state rule. And then there's a property here, or a method here, that says is applicable given the state. Is this rule applicable to the state? And so that's all that the base class is specifying in terms of the API or the interface. Now, when you design classes, especially when you intend to use them for polymorphism, the base class should be completely abstract, or in C++ you would say, pure virtual, or in Delphi you would say abstract interface. Not that the interface name means anything in regards to interfaces, but essentially everything about that class is abstract. So you're not fixing descendants on implementation, which in some cases is a good thing, as in, if there's a common implementation, it's going to be common, then you could of course specify that in the base class as well. But if you don't know that the descendants will all be having a common implementation or not, don't need common infrastructure, let's say, then don't specify it. Right now, maybe once you've designed your classes, implemented these classes, and you're coming to the point where you get a good sense of in what direction the descendants are flowing, then you might want to rethink or relook at your implementation of the descendants. Say, okay, given that this is commonality in all the descendants, you can roll that up into the base class. Okay, so that's fine. Just don't start that way with the assumption that you know all of the possible descendants and all of their implementation requirements, if you will, where the base class might implement certain infrastructure. Okay, in this case, it's a abstract interface. Again, not interface, it's a class, it's completely abstract. Then there's one other descendant. That's another rule. And of course, these names would be some more businessy kinds of rules. I'm not using business terms here. So, the rule name should specify what the rule really is, not 1, 2, 3, 4. Or sometimes you even have rule numbers in an organization where there's like an Excel spreadsheet that maps rule number 1357.2 means this, right? So use the name as much as possible. But if the organization or the analysts and the business people know that rule better by the number, then of course use the number. It's a descendant of that base class. Its implementation is saying I'm going to define a private member, in this case, private read-only member. And this specific rule applies to these states. So in this case, these are US states, Arizona, Indiana, Maryland. And then the implementation of the abstract method here is applicable, is basically saying, is the state that you're giving me here, as in you're asking for, is that state in my set of states? If it is, then this rule is applicable. If not, it's not. So it's a very simple thing, nothing really confusing. The next implementation is doing the same thing. It's declared this variable as a private read-only member here, and it says this rule, rule 2, applies to the states Indiana and Maryland, but not to, in this case, Arizona, right? Okay, so the question is this. This works. There's nothing wrong with it in terms of its functionality. It works exactly as expected. The question is, what's wrong with this design, class design? So you can pause here, examine it. I think, you're seeing all the full code base. So examine it, and when you're ready, you can continue to watch it. I'm going to now present to you the answer. Now, there are a couple of different ways to dice this. Of course, there are many more than a couple. In my opinion, there are 2 ways to do it. I'm going to present to you one, and I'll talk about the other, but the reason I'm presenting the one is that's what I prefer. You might have other implementations. If you feel, your implementation deserves merit, post it in the comments and with your code as well. Or send me, the code somewhere as a link so I can go look at it there, and I can give you my opinion. If this implementation, your version of this implementation is better than what I have, or is on par, or whatever, right? Okay, so the solution. So what I've done here is the base class now has the implementation. If you look at these are in different projects, so let me just swap to this project. If you look at the Descendants, they have the same implementation. And they also have this. So you're repeating yourself in this case, right? If you're saying that all Descendants will implement a hash set and their implementation always is going to be the same, the first thing you look at is, okay, well, if that's the case, what can I do to not have this repeated in every Descendant? I mean, we've got, like in the US, we've got 50 states. Do you want to seriously, or, sometimes businesses have thousands of rules. Do you want to have thousands of classes, Descendants that have this repetition and this repetition, except for the fact that this part is changing, right? So that's what you need to look at. So it's okay if you started down this path, right? Just kind of get the API firmed up and things. In regards to the design or the hierarchy and the Descendants, look at the implementation. Once you look at this implementation, you say, okay, now that I know that the API is correct, my system is working with this one method, is applicable and it's all working fine. Is this implementation correct? Right? So the commonality needs to be rolled up to base class. So that's what the solution is doing. One of the things it's doing here is saying, well, this implementation is always the same in all the Descendants, so therefore we can do that. But at this point, you're sort of fixating all Descendants on the fact that there's a hash set somewhere. And then as a result, you're also implementing or defining a member of a hash set and then using that over here. And that might be okay. You could say, well, all Descendants just need to have a set of states. It's not like it's coming from a database, or even if it were coming from a database, the fact is it still can be contained within a hash set, in memory at runtime. But be careful when you start to confine Descendants implementations. It may be okay, as I said, for most cases. That's actually perfectly fine, and because all you're doing here is the rules are different. But let's say you're working with, like in the past, I've shown you a code that talks to RabbitMQ versus Service Bus versus MSMQ and things. They're quite a bit different, right? They're not simple in-memory kinds of things. Their implementations can vary quite a bit. So you don't want to, at that point, when you're dealing with those kinds of classes where the implementations differ quite a bit, but you want to fixate the Descendants because of something the ancestor has, besides the API, besides the interface, all right? Anyway, so that's that. So the moment you do this, the moment you roll out this method and implement this in the base class, you are effectively saying all Descendants will now have to implement a hash set or somehow populate this hash set. So the question then becomes, how does the Descendant populate the hash set? There's a couple of ways to do that. One is this member could be protected and Descendants can set it. Right? This member could be protected and Descendants could set the values, like inline. They could set the value here, or Descendants could, in their constructor, rather than calling the base class constructor like it's doing over here, Descendants could set the property or the protected member in their constructor. Right? I don't like that. Generally, I prefer to send the data upstream to the base class. In this case, this kind of a scenario. So I opted out for that, where I have a constructor in the base class that says, give me a hash set, and I'll assign it to my local member here. So this member is private, not protected, and the implementation can access that private member. So Descendants simply have to pass in the hash set that comprises of the set of states that rule applies to. And that's that. I'm sure you can think of many other implementations for this particular thing. I'd be interested to see what you have, if you think your design is better, or if you want to, ask me why I think I didn't go down this path or that path. I'll try and answer that, the reasoning behind it. Sometimes it's just preferences. Sometimes it just makes more sense. So depending on what you present, I might say I just prefer it this way, or I can tell you why I prefer this, what I've shown you here versus what you're probably presenting, because there are certain problems with it. So, okay, so now I'm going to move on to the method design part. In method design, I have a few things I'm very, very particular about. But I don't know about a few things. I mean, everything I'm saying I'm particular about, but there are a few things I find people are constantly kind of deviating from those guidelines. And the reason I feel the guidelines is because they are just extremely important to implement, to make a habit. So I'm hoping with some of the things I talk about today, those are like the key things. It's very hard for me to say, these are the 3 things out of these 15 things that are the key things. I think they're all important. So, but I'm trying to extract some of the things I see very regularly. One of them is I'll use the phrases. Okay, the phrases I use when I do a code review. Need to know basis. Okay, this is method should be given the bare minimum information, nothing more, nothing less. The short form of that is need to know basis. If you ask me, Shiv, can you tell me blah blah? I like, let's say we're in an organization, I can't share that information with you because you're like at a certain level, but I can't divulge that information. I'm going to say it's a need to know basis. You don't need to know, I need to know. Similarly, when you're working with a method, you're providing it with arguments. Don't give it more than it needs to know. Right? So my short form of that is need to know basis. The other one is don't invent names. Just don't invent names. So I'll explain that. It has many, many meanings, but the idea is the same. Don't invent names. And third one here is encapsulate conditionals. We're going to look at all these 3 things. There maybe there's a fourth hidden somewhere, I'm not sure, but at least at a high level, these are the things. So let's look at that. Of course, the naming is just key. I can't keep repeating that, but it's just one of the biggest problems I think we have is coming up with the proper name, whether it's a method name or a class name or a argument name, whatever. So, but I'm going to not restate that here. Okay, so let's look at that implementation. All right, so before I actually start describing this code, once again, the code works as expected. There's absolutely nothing wrong. There's no bug in the code itself. The problem is with the code review or the design review, phase where I'm finding some issues. So there are some caveats or some things I'll just specify here. It's written in comments there as well in the code, but just so you understand where to look and where not to look. All right, now there's a little more than just one method here. So you may not be able to see the whole thing in one screen or one thing. So I might have to scroll up and down. All right, okay. So a couple of things. The reason that these properties are uppercased with the underscores here, I think they call it snake case to the extent that they're underscores, but the uppercase part, this was a decision we made, as a team for n number of reasons. And so barring the fact of, in addition, there was the documentation was in this form, the analysts knew this data and all these fields, if you will, in this form. And so it was just, everyone was familiar with this style and this naming convention. So we just followed that along. There was no need to change something when it's only there's a disconnect between the devs and the analysts or the business. It just became a hard conversation to have. So that's the reason these fees have remained or are in this fashion. All right. And there are some acronyms for you. You may not understand what these things are. It doesn't matter for this purpose, but these are well known and understood acronyms in the business. And so we retain that naming convention as well, just because when you spell it out, it's fairly long and everyone just knows in the team and everyone in the business just knows that's what this means. So as long as it is well known and understood across the entire team or organization, use the acronyms if that makes sense. Okay, so there's something called a policy, and start from here. I'm already seeing a problem here. There should be called a policy. Okay. The issue is not so much with this method. The issue is really with the next one. So this is just, imagine this is like in some other part of your application. It's calling that this this method, right? So the idea really is that you're calling this method given this policy. So somehow this policy gets hydrated. Doesn't matter here. This is no issue here. It's really this method we look at. So now I'm going to scroll down to this method. Hopefully it fits. So it does fit on the screen. Okay. So the question to you is, what's wrong with this code? Again, what's wrong meaning it's working. It's exactly as it's expected, the behavior, the outcome, but it's wrong from the perspective of code review, design review. So pause this video, take a look, spend as much time as you need to, make notes, and then come back and unpause it. I'm going to give you the solution to this. Before I show you the sort of the fixed up code, I'm going to explain it here while the problem exists. Now, as a new person to this team, let's say, we understand this as C# code. We do understand, even though there's lots of conditionals like this and this or that. It is complicated, but it's still understandable from a C# standpoint. It's not like you don't understand the code, correct? but you have no idea what the business side of this equation means. Meaning, why do we have to do this comparison? What does it mean to the business? You're losing that aspect. And it's important to retain that aspect. It's not enough to just write readable C# code. If you're losing the meaning of what it is you're writing, then that's a problem. So in cases like this, we have conditional statements. Of course, there's multiple, ands and ors and all that. It means something to the business. If they don't have a name for it, ask them and get them to create a name and define a name. And from that point forward, use that name, whatever that name may be. It's important to name that rule, that condition. Like, what does that mean to the business? And then encapsulate conditionals. And I'll show you what that is in the solution. With this, what's happening is I can understand it as a C# programmer, but I don't understand from a business standpoint. And when I say business, I don't mean, business system, enterprise, something. If it's a game, same thing, right? In the game, that conditional might mean something in the game. So that's what I mean by business, not necessarily just a business system. So all of these conditionals, even they're simple to read. What does it mean to the business? And you want to know that part here. So rather than seeing the how, I want to know the what. I don't care to know the how right off the bat. This is at this level of abstraction. It's a public method. It's the highest level abstraction, highest level abstraction, which means it doesn't have implementation as much as telling me how it's doing stuff. Sorry, the what is it doing, not the how part, right? So one aspect, of course, encapsulate conditional. Take this logic out of here and do this somewhere else. Same thing with all of these, right? But give them proper business names. Now here you're already getting a squiggly here. Basically what it's saying is that this is a date time, it's a value type, and this value type has no path in the code here where it's not been assigned. So this assignment is useless. Actually, what is it saying here exactly? Remove this useless. Remove this useless assignment. And it, to me, is an important thing. I mean, I'm laughing at it because of the way they say it, useless assignment. It sounds very much like me. But take it out. Don't unnecessarily confuse me, because when I'm seeing this, like you assigned this to a min value, like why is that? Like why min value? I'm thinking, oh my God, like this, I don't understand that reasoning. So don't unnecessarily add confusion in my head. If it's not required, first of all, just don't do it. If it's min value or max value or whatever you decide on, explain that. Maybe assign it to a variable that has the name that explains the purpose or reasoning for it, and then assign that here, right? Just directly saying min value, I have no idea why it became min value. What if I did it was max value? What would happen? So this is not required. Take that out. Okay, another thing that is not obvious here, of course, and I don't expect anyone to know that right off the bat. But of course, first of all, this policy should be called policy tab. Don't invent names. Don't invent names. That's what it means. If something's called a policy, then policy tab. Doesn't make sense. So this should be called policy. If you're saying in the business, in your code, in your team, hey, but policy tab is a better name, then rename the class to policy tab. Okay. It's not okay to have one type, one name, and the arguments a different name, or local variables to be a different name, unless there's a collision. Don't invent names. Because that's forcing you to define the name of the class or the whatever it is, the method better. Right? So you don't invent names. The other part that's not obvious here is, I'm just going to show you this, so I can't expect you to have known this ahead of time, but I'm going to show you what I mean. So here's the policy class, and it's got, all these properties. That's a ton of properties. Oh my gosh, there's a lot of properties here. And then, so as you can see, there's a whole ton of properties to the policy class. Now that you know that, what can you say about the method signature, which is this method expecting you to give it a policy type instance? Exactly. Need to know basis. This method is being given way too much information. It doesn't need to know all that information. If you look at the whole code here, it probably is operating on 6 or so arguments. That's it, or properties from the policy tab. And people ask me this all the time. So when do you decide when to define a new type? So in this case, I'm saying define a new type. That policy type is not the type that this class needs. This method needs. This method should say, okay, I need this, let's say 6 arguments. Typically, if it goes beyond 3 or 4 arguments, I should just define a type. Don't have a method that requires 6, 7, 8, 10 arguments, right? Just define a type. Then the thing is, but how many types are you going to have? There's going to be a clutter of types in your system. That's fine. These types, you have to name them and you confine them in the areas of the system that use them. Right? So they're only used here and seen here. And if you don't know what that means, you might want to look at one of my videos on. By the way, if you haven't seen my Programming with Intent method design video, I'll put a link to it over here. Some of this stuff has already been discussed there, so you can kind of see a much fuller explanation of that. I'm going pretty quick here. Okay, so need to know basis and defining a type, specialized type for this method in this case, because it needs 5 or 6 arguments out of the 100 and whatever arguments you saw there. Define the type. Don't worry about the time and the cost of writing, don't get lazy, because that extra effort that you put in to have this method ask for a very specific type that has those arguments is going to go a long way in helping you understand your code in the long run. And it's possible that maybe it's got one extra argument. There's another method that needs, one less argument. This one needs one more argument, whatever. I'll leave that up to your discretion. Whether you want to define new types to it, I'm thinking you probably just have a hard time naming these things and differentiating them. So maybe if there's 1 or 2 properties that are, in excess or less, whatever, that's fine. But 150, 200 properties versus 6, 7, 8 properties, I don't think so. Similarly with some class that has, let's say 10 properties and you only need 3, that's not, in my books, that's not acceptable as well, right? Need to know basis. Give the method the bare minimum information. Nothing more, nothing less. By nothing less, I've discovered that there's another method design guideline that I have in Programming with Intent, which is methods should be autonomous or pure. I'm not going to explain that here. That is in that video I linked to earlier. What are anonymous methods and what are pure methods? But the idea is when I say nothing less, it's really saying give the method everything it relies on. Don't expect the method's implementation to go depend on private members or properties of that class. And give it everything it needs. So that's what it really means, short form of it. Okay, let's look at the solution. All right. So this is the sort of the fixed up version of the code. This part is the same. You can see here that this is called policy now. It wasn't whatever it was before. And we're still focusing on this one method here with the one argument. This argument has become policy tab expiration criteria, which is a specialized DTO, if you will, that has these 6 properties, and that's all it has. So the idea is that the call site, in this case, you can see that the call site is constructing an instance of this from policy in this case, right? So it is the responsibility of the call site to give you exactly what you're asking for. You as the person or thing that designed the method says, I need this method to get only this information. That's it. And the call site then becomes responsible for defining, or in this case, creating that instance and assigning the properties. All right. So the other thing is, when I say don't invent names, what would this, if this is such a long name, now if you're not happy with the name of the class, of course you should change the name of the class. Don't fight the name of the class, or don't leave the name of the class this way and keep fighting it each time you use this class in a code base. You're trying to fight with the name. So, but the IDE here always helps you with the same name. So don't fight the IDE. I've seen many times developers either don't care to know, or I'm not quite sure exactly what it is, but they don't know how the IDE works, in this case, Visual Studio. Learn how the IDE works and learn to work with the IDE, not against the IDE. The more you understand how the IDE functions, the more efficient you're going to become, right? Because you'll start to use the IDE for its features and not battle with it because you have your own style of programming and writing code, and then you're saying, but this thing is not working for me at all. For example, I know that as soon as I do that, I'm going to see the name, and pretty much the first choice is the choice. So because I know that's how it works, I'm not struggling with using the IDE and working with the IDE, right? Sometimes there are cases where you're looking for some method name or a class name, and it's got a long name, right? So you should know what letters to type. It's almost like the Pascal case, the camel casing, the letters that we make uppercase. The IDE will help you with that. So if it's a long name for a class or a method, but it's got, like a Pascal case or a camel case, just type those letters in, and the IDE will help you with finding the right method, the right class name or whatever, much faster. So that's what I mean by don't fight the IDE. Learn the IDE and work with the IDE. Get the IDE to work for you by basically you working for the IDE, being, understanding how the IDE works and making use of how it works. All right. So as you can see here, this method has been given a name. Now I've of course changed names here quite a bit because it's too kind of businessy. So I've made it a little less businessy, so people might think like, oh, what's the point of that? And the long-winded naming also is intentional. Normally like this, as I said, there are some acronyms we use in the business. It's just that. So this whole thing might just translate to that acronym. But it's telling me, policy tab record has no expiration activity timestamp. I said, oh, okay, that's what you mean by that condition. How do you do that? I don't want to know here. At least I know what it is you want. I don't need to know how you determine that. If I wanted to go there, I can go there and look at it. So I can say, oh, okay, so the way you determine this criteria or this condition is by doing that. Right? But it's not something that, I need to worry about over here. Now, when I say don't invent names here, again, it's in this case, you can see that I'm inventing a name in some ways, right? Because this is a datetime. Why didn't I just call this a datetime? But there are times when, if I just said this is a datetime, you don't know what am I sending here, right? Since it's a datetime. Now, in some systems, like especially domain-driven design, you would define your specialized types. So even this is a datetime, you would not use datetime in your classes or in your properties. You specify your own type that internally has a datetime, but that type will have a specific name, so that it will be called expiration date. The type will be called expiration date. So then you can ask for expiration date, and it's not just a datetime. I haven't done that here, and I don't generally do that, but I'll have a name. So in this case, it's saying this is an expiration activity timestamp. It's a datetime in terms of its type, but what are you sending me? Expiration activity timestamp. So I need to name it specifically because the datetime in itself is not enough to understand what is that datetime, which datetime, right? So in this case, you do want to define a name. So you are in some ways inventing a name. If you have specialized types for these things, then of course you would use that. And that's how you implement it. So most of these datetime methods here, they all define a name for, okay, there's so many datetimes here. So you have to specify, you have to invent a name. But the name here is the business name of that datetime. So this is expiration date, effective date, expiration type code, and effective type code. So the names, and of course you can see this is snake case. Again, this was by decision, just because that's how we know it in the system. For the same reason, there's some amount of legacy knowledge in regards to the business and the analyst, and so they prefer to communicate with us in those terms. So every method has been extracted. So encapsulate conditional means extract that logic into a separate method. Okay, the method will need the arguments it needs. That's the arguments that are being sent to the method. But how does a method implement that is, of course, you see it in the implementation and not outside the method. We just key not only for the sake of providing the abstraction, but also key from the purpose of being able to understand the code. Like, what is the code doing from a business standpoint? What does it mean? This big winded conditional, what does it actually mean? So that's the benefit of encapsulating conditionals, but also removing the start. And this will actually reduce the code complexity. So cyclomatic complexity that you have in code analysis. I agree with the cyclomatic complexity in that I don't want it. Right? Conditionals already make things a little hard to read. You can't help that in business systems, especially where there's bunches of rules that are involved there. So make your life simpler by encapsulating conditionals. Don't embed it all in the one method. Move out the logic or implementation of that conditional outside and leave behind the business meaning or the sort of definition of what it is you're doing from a business standpoint. So it's easy to understand the code. Right. So what we've done, what am I here? Okay. So we've defined our own type. This has only the properties that we need to use in this implementation here. And we have that. We've removed that assignment here. It's not required. We've encapsulated conditionals, and that's that. Right. Well, this was short and sweet. I do have a bit of an announcement to make here. I have posted I forget what it's called, community post on YouTube. Nonetheless, I'll put links to my email address here. It's not my email address. Well, it is mine. It's not my personal email address. I'm making an email available to people on my channel to post code. So I want you to participate. I want you to send me code. and I'll review the code and as a code review here in the videos. You'll be anonymous, so it doesn't matter. Even if you invented the code, I really don't care who wrote the code, why you wrote it. As long as I can read it and understand it, I can provide you with my comments and my review as to why I would fix this or change that or whatever it is, right? So there's a email I'm going to make. It's in the show notes below. Please take a look at that. You can send me a zip file. Don't send me the bins and all that. I'll never see those emails. So make sure you send me just pure code, .cs files and things, like no DLLs and NuGet packages and all that. Otherwise, I'll never see it. And or you have a GitHub repo somewhere in the email, just send me the link to the GitHub repo. I can go get it from there, right? Keep it simple. If you need to explain to me what that code is doing, it may not be simple. Nonetheless, don't shy away from explaining it in case I need some background information, some context just to understand. Don't try and justify the code you have. Just explain to me what the code is doing, right? I'll sort of be more ambivalent. So if I don't hear justifications, my aim is to make sure, can I read this code? If I were to join your team today, would I read that code? Able to read that code without understand it? I may not understand the business, but can I understand the code, right? Okay, so I'm looking forward to your participation and sending me all those emails. Of course, be patient. I might get a flood of emails. Next thing you know, I don't have enough time. Or maybe I get no emails with no code, and then I have to figure out, what to do in the next video on these series. Anyways, so it doesn't really matter. But I hope you guys participate. All right. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Oh, by the way, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I find for some reason, most views come from none of my subscribers, right? So my subscribers are like 10% of the views. So if you watch these videos on a regular basis, might as well subscribe. It'll help me. And if you haven't hit the notify button, because that's the other thing, I find that most views are not from notifications. There's like 10% of my subscribers have turned on notifications, yet they do come and watch the videos. So if you haven't turned on notifications, please hit the notify button. I don't know exactly where it is, but hit it so you get notified, and I will see you next time.